Looks like it's preparing to live stream. And this will allow people to filter in. Okay, good. Looks like it's okay. Looks like it's working now. Let me go back over here. And welcome everybody. Tonight the title of this is called Hierarchies in Health. And the reason I entitled it that is because lately I've been thinking about a lot of different things in terms of hierarchies. Now, what we're finding, unfortunately, is that there are certain communities that are disadvantaged that are, I guess you could say, lower on a certain type of hierarchy that are suffering more from COVID. And I've noticed that there tends to be a hierarchy of health in the sense that nowadays we have available to us all kinds of modern conveniences, regardless of our socioeconomic status. In other words, the king of and the feudal lord and the king of a couple hundred years ago would envy, someone with very modest means. Nowadays, most homes have very big screen TV. They have fresh water. They have reliable, obviously reliable shelter. The ability to have a clean environment. These are a whole host of modern conveniences that, as I said, would make a king from a couple hundred years ago incredibly jealous. And as a result of that, I feel as though there are, unfortunately, a group of, looking at society as a whole, a group of people who are marching towards health, and another group that's marching away from health. And I see like there's almost a hierarchy of health that's developing. And I believe that given the modern conveniences that I've just spoken about, that anyone, regardless of their socioeconomic status, cultural background, has the capabilities to be able to ascend this sort of hierarchy of developing and becoming their own authority, as I always say, to become healthier and to have the resources available to be able to become healthy. Now, looking back in history, it's interesting because years and years ago, it was the kings that actually sometimes were the most unhealthy. They were the ones that were really incredibly overweight and had gout from all the meat and the wine that they would drink. And in many places, assuming the calorie needs were being achieved, the peasants actually were more robust and healthy because they were eating mostly plant foods and living off the food on the farm. And the wealthy, incredibly wealthy people and the feudal lord and king and such were sitting on their throne, overweight, drinking wine and eating meat. Now, what's happening nowadays is that in a way, that we're seeing some of the illnesses of this sort of abundance that all of us have the capability of. And we're sort of, oftentimes they say overfed and undernourished. And as I said, I see this sort of hierarchy developing, and I feel as though we should discuss it. But we're also going to be talking about looking at hierarchies of health, looking at it from different perspectives. So let me share my screen. That is probably a little overblown in terms of an introduction. Now, let me share my screen here. Okay. So tonight, as I said, we'll be talking about hierarchies of health. We'll talk about what a hierarchy is, and then we'll go through the categories of health. Now, the definition of a hierarchy is an arrangement or classification of things according to relative importance or inclusiveness. And also, obviously, society is structured and institutions are structured in a hierarchy. And what we know from biology and history is that for millions of years, natural animals organize in a type of hierarchy. All we need to do is watch a National Geographic episode, and we see how there's a dominant chimpanzee or a dominant bear that is basically, lording over the rest. And unfortunately, these hierarchies are built into humanity, into the earth. any sort of organized living system is organized in the structure of hierarchy. We can also look at hierarchies in terms of different categories as well. Excuse me, let me turn this off. And we can't abolish these hierarchies because they are built into, they're millions of years old. They're programmed into our DNA. But as I said, since I'm dealing with health, I realize nowadays we're so very lucky with all the conveniences that we have that there is no one that can't ascend the hierarchy of health so that they can become the healthiest that they possibly can be. And we've spoken about the 80-20 rule before, but the reason why these are important is because a hierarchy by definition is really where one thing is much, much more important than all the others. And we've spoken about the 80-20 rule, which is basically what's often called the law of the vital few, or 80% of the effects arise from 20% of the causes. And, I've spoken about this many, many times before, and given examples, like as an example, 20% of your clothes you wear 80% of the time, that sort of thing. 20% of the customers of a business usually make up 80% of the profits, and 20% of the land is owned, 80% of the land is owned by 20% of the population. This is a way of reflecting in a general kind of rule that's not exact, of course, that there are certain situations and certain things, certain impacts, certain causes that are going to have a greater effect. And by looking at things from this way, we get a better and clearer understanding of how this earth and the institutions, organizations, and biological systems are basically organized. That I guess you could say, unfortunately, there is an unequal distribution of these sorts of things. This is just the nature of it. You can't abolish this, but what you can do is have a better understanding of it, so that once you have an understanding of it, hopefully you'll be able to make the right decisions for yourself. Of course, we're dealing with health here, so being able to select out those things that are going to have the most impact on your health. The other rule is something called Price's Law. Now, Price's Law says that 50% of the work is done by the square root of the total number of people who participate. Let me just make that a lot easier. Let's say you have 25 writers, is usually how the example goes. And basically, or 25 employees. The square root of that is 5. So what this rule says is that if you have 25 employees, 50% of the work is going to be done by 5 people. And again, this is very similar to the 80-20 rule. It's a way of classifying and understanding why smaller things can have greater effects, and that this is something that is just fundamental to the world. And anyone who thinks that they can go out and try to make everything equal is going to always fail, because this is a rule that exists throughout all, as I said, throughout all institutions, all biological, groups, everything. So keep that in mind as we're talking about going through the categories of health. Okay. The next thing I wanted to discuss is rights and privileges. And there's a Dr. Robert Rondell Gibson definition, and actually George Carlin had the same definition. And basically, he said that a right is something that you earned and can't be taken away from you. Because health and even life can be taken away from you with the right poison or weapon, it's distinctly a privilege. Now, the reason I'm bringing up rights and privileges here is because right now we're dealing with a lot of people who are just incredibly bored at home, and they're binge watching Netflix. A lot of people are stuck at home, and I think a lot of times we miss the fact that almost everything we have is actually a privilege and not a right. And when we can have this ready understanding of the fact that most of what we have is actually a privilege, then probably the best way to deal with the privilege is to try to maintain, enhance, and maybe gain more privileges, but at the very least to have gratitude for the fact that it's not something that we earned a right to, but is actually a privilege. So as I go through the categories of health, I would just like you to remind yourself of the fact that everything that we're dealing with, that it sounds like perhaps it'll sound like I'm going overboard into details, but really what I'm trying to explain is that we have these privileges, and in order to reinforce these privileges and to have gratitude for these privileges and to grow and maybe develop more privileges, which is essentially ascending into sort of a hierarchy of health, of becoming more and more refined in your health and being able to contribute what you are here to contribute. So it's really about securing these privileges and not mistaking them for rights, because once you mistake them for rights, you don't have the same degree of appreciation for what they are. And again, if it can be taken away from you, it is not a right, it's a privilege. And most of what we have is privilege. Okay, so let's go into these categories of health. And again, that was a very long-winded introduction, but wanted to go through that because I feel like it's important. Now, we've spoken about the 4 pillars of health before, and what we're going to be doing is looking at it through a different lens. We're looking at it through the lens of hierarchy, lens of levels, and what those levels are. And we'll be breaking them down into, as I've done many times, nutrition, mental state, environmental influences, and movement and mechanics. Now, really, we're not going to be spending a whole lot on nutrition tonight because I've gone through the 80-20 of nutrition, essentially, about how to pick the various categories of food. Obviously, plants are going to be the category, the 20% category of foods, vegetables more particularly, that is going to have the most impact on improving your health. That's the 20% that's going to impact the 80%. But it really comes down to, I think, the clearest rule of eating that there can be, which is from Michael Pollan's In Defense of Food. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. And that really just sums it up. But the point is that how do we identify this 80-20 or Price's Law? Well, we have various plants. We have plants can be broken down into, things like vegetables. Vegetables can be then broken down into different categories of vegetables, like cruciferous vegetables, and different categories like lettuces, which are in what are essentially the daisy family. But basically, you want to have vegetables are going to be that category. Leafy greens, and then fruits, obviously, are going to be a little bit less, but still more important. But how to select, how to identify, and how to look at your food in terms of categories. And the category, obviously, is going to be plant-based. Having mostly plants is going to be the most important thing for you. But we've already spent week after week. We're at episode 41, and we've spoken, many, many times about how to make that selection in terms of food. So we're not going to go into that. So let's spend a little bit of time on mental state and the hierarchies of your mental state. Many of you have heard of Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And we're going to go through that, and we're going to look at it from a little bit of a different perspective. Now, this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I'm sure many of you, whoops, sorry, looks like I'm no longer sharing my screen. 1 second. Okay. Right. All right. Hopefully you can see my screen. If you can't see my screen, let me know in the chat box. So we're going to go through Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If many of you have probably heard of this before, but we're going to go through it in detail, but looking at it from a little bit of a different perspective. So it starts out with physiological needs: food, water, warmth, rest. And these are essentially, you go from the basic needs to psychological needs to self-fulfillment needs. And physical needs are at the very bottom of the pyramid. And his original description of this was that one has to be satisfied before you get to the other. That isn't, a lot of people don't really feel that's necessarily the case. Nonetheless, the description is going to be helpful to go through. So physiological needs, food, water, warmth, rest. Safety needs come next, talking about security and safety. Then comes belongingness and love, intimate relationships, friends, esteem needs, and then self-actualization, where you basically are able to do creative activities and achieve your full potential. So let's look at these breaking these down into different categories. So let's talk about physiological. So we've spoken about food and how to sort of determine what your 80-20 rule is, or your Price's law in terms of that. But how can you make it better? Well, we've spent many times talking about that already. You can make it better by incrementally increasing the quality of the food that you're eating. And you do that by starting out with, basic conventionally grown produce. Obviously, you can continually refine this by getting organic or locally grown. There's always a way of continuing to refine and to improve the quality of the food that you're eating. Maybe you start out eating conventionally bought meat, and then you move to making sure that the meat is, pasture raised, grass fed. All of these things, it's nice to be able to make incremental improvements in these decisions, because it's a way of moving in a life-giving direction. That's basically what it's doing. Obviously, not all of us can afford some of those things, but you do what you can. If you can't buy organic produce, then how do you make it more higher quality? You do that by making sure you rinse. Maybe you start growing something at home if you can. Finding a community garden. There's many ways of continuing to refine your food choices. When it comes to water, how do you slowly make changes and incremental improvements in your hydration? Well, you can look at it from high water content food. We spoke about many weeks ago about how probably the way the water is in a matrix inside the vegetables and the fruits makes a big difference in terms of the amount of hydration that you have, and how to measure your hydration, how to make sure you're getting enough fluid as well. That's how you make it better. Breath. Again, what's your 80-20 and Price's law? Well, you can always make your breath better. I know it sounds kind of crazy, but breath is a very complicated thing. If we're not paying attention to it, it's really just, we wake up when we're breathing, we maybe breathe at a different frequency when we're asleep. We're out of breath when we exercise. We don't really put a whole lot of thought into it. But there's something called resonant frequency of breathing, which is basically where you, believe it or not, if you breathe a certain amount of in breaths and out breaths per minute, you can actually get a syncing up of your brain with your body, and it allows you to enter into a really deep state of relaxation, and somewhere between like 5.5 or 6 frequencies per minute breath. And there's actually an app that I have on my phone called Breathing app, and you can actually set it for like a 6 breath in, 6 breath out frequency, and it will give you a tone so you know when to breathe in, when to breathe out. And really, it's pretty amazing that if you can just do 15 minutes or more of this frequency of breathing, you really enter this incredibly deep sense of relaxation. So that's how you optimize breath. You optimize breath by increasing your lung capacity, by exercising. All of these things are ways of taking what is essentially a physiological need and then bringing it up to another level, having a deeper understanding of what that is, and then improving upon it. And that's how you think about these things. Now, what about homeostasis? Homeostasis is the amount of balance you have. It also reflects your ability to be resilient. And if you don't have a good sense of what allows you to rest and recharge, then you're not going to be building resilience, because resilience is a function of the balance of your nervous system. And if you're not getting enough of that rest and recharge, you are completely out of balance. Now, assuming you are in balance in the sense of you're getting 15 to 20 minutes a day of relaxation, maybe you're doing that by doing some breathing exercises or some exercise, or making sure you get enough sleep. Well, what can you do to make it better? How can you build on the privilege of developing homeostasis? What can you do to improve on the privilege of having a resilient nervous system? Well, you can actually make it better. And there's something called environmental hormesis. Now, basically, hormesis is something where you give your body a little bit of a stress, and then your body becomes more stronger as a result of that. And obviously, exercise is a type of hormesis where you're basically causing a little bit of muscle damage so that when it repairs itself, it builds things up. Well, if you built homeostasis, then through exercise, but you can also do it through environmental hormesis. Assuming you have resilience, then we find that going into a sauna or doing cold treatments like cryotherapy and such can do the same sort of thing. That there's this little insult that you do to your body through heat or cold, and when you're healing, you end up in a better place. Oftentimes, you end up with a better antioxidant status. You get regeneration of what's called glutathione, and that increase in glutathione allows your body to be able to handle oxidative stress, which we've spoken about before. To make it simple, basically what's happening is that you are building even more resilience by actually submitting yourself to a little bit of stress. So that's how you take the privilege of homeostasis and turn it into something and secure that privilege by making it better. Okay, so that's a physiological level. Just doing a time check. Next is safety. And so people are often, after they have their physiological needs met, often they move towards safety needs. So obviously that can encompass financial security, fears about health, safety against accidents and injuries. But what makes us get stuck here? And that is assessing the false emergency state. In other words, is it really a risk? And this false emergency state basically is a concept that unless your life is immediately at danger, especially in our world, it's really not an emergency. That's the only emergency. And oftentimes in our lives, we're never really, in the very, very rare, 99% of the times when our body is reacting as if we are in a unsafe situation is actually a false emergency. And by asking ourselves, is this a true emergency? Then we can sometimes break that. And a lot of times people are, many people, especially with the way the media is and making us fear everything. Unfortunately, a lot of us are basically caught in this false emergency state where we just think that it's all doom and gloom. And unfortunately, there's nothing we can do. But as I've said before in other episodes, we should continually ask ourselves, especially when we're being bombarded by messages, is this a true emergency or not? Next is belongingness. So you move from physiological needs. Then once you feel safe, then most of the time people start to then focus on belongingness. And this can involve friendships, romantic attachments, families, social groups, religious groups. And what makes us get stuck here is, as what a teacher of mine used to say, is laying yourself down on the altar of another's desire. A lot of times when we get into situations, into social situations, then we sometimes lose some of our authenticity and give up our power by doing things only because of the expectations of others. And as one of my teachers used to say, what you're basically doing is putting yourself down on the altar of another's desires, and that's essentially betraying who you are and your authenticity. So that's what oftentimes allows people to get stuck at this level. All right. Next is esteem needs. And this is, so once we feel like we belong to a family, a group, etc., in a healthy way, then we move into esteem needs. So this involves recognition and feelings of accomplishment, and what helps us progress past this stage. And that is to do a self-image analysis. I can't tell you how often I'll have someone, a client or a patient who's as an example, either trying to lose weight. I'll give that one example, trying to lose weight, and they really can't imagine at all themselves as their optimal weight. They don't have any image of it whatsoever. And if you don't have an image of that, and you close your eyes and all you see is what you are now, and you're not able to see what you want to become, then you're never going to achieve that. And therefore, I often lead people through imagery exercises to allow them to imagine seeing themselves in the mirror the way they want to be. The same thing, unfortunately, happens with diseases. Now, obviously, there's certain diseases that one can't do anything about, but there are also lots of conditions that changing your lifestyle can make enormous improvements. Unfortunately, a lot of people, especially if you've been suffering from a condition for a very long period of time, tend to identify, it becomes part of their self-image, that they can't actually separate themselves from the disease itself. And if you can't do that, then I don't care how many lifestyle interventions that we do, there's always going to be self-sabotage, because oftentimes people can't disengage from the identity of having X disease. Now, I'm not making light of conditions that one has difficulty or it's impossible to get rid of, but we're talking about I'm generally talking about chronic conditions that can often be improved by all kinds of lifestyle behaviors and habits. And of course, he's spoken about that at length. The other thing that can help progress in this stage is to help others. I've always loved to quote Zig Ziglar here, which basically said, you can get everything you want in life if you help enough other people get what they want. There's nothing that improves your self-image more than doing a selfless act for someone else. That raises your self-image so much. And that's why charity has almost magical, mystical effects or descriptions in all the world's traditions. And I think, obviously, being someone of faith, that there is something somewhat magical and mystical going on when you perform an act of charity. But on top of it, a lot of it is you're probably inviting onto yourself because of you see yourself as someone who is capable of helping others, and therefore you immediately have an elevation in your self-image, and that's often a magical thing. Next is self-actualization, and then once you get to that point where you feel as though you have feelings of accomplishment and recognition that you are someone of worth, then you move on to self-actualization. Now, I was just reading recently this book, 12 Rules for Life, and he was describing how when people have pets, they are very compliant at giving their pets their medications, but when they need to take medicine for themselves, people are very non-compliant with medications, very, very much so. It's very uncommon, believe it or not, for people to have the same amount of compliance that they do for their pets. And in the book, he was trying to explain, well, why is that? And one of the explanations he gave was that we see dogs as these innocent and pure kinds of beings that deserve to be treated well, and therefore we give the dog the medicine all the time. But when it comes to us, we have many of us are so bogged down by not having feelings of worth and accomplishment that people don't generally have a good self-image, that unfortunately that they're actually worthy of that, and it can manifest as not taking care of yourself and such. The reason I mentioned these privileges, the difference between rights and privileges, is that one way of getting past that is to see that we have so many privileges, that it gives us some incentive to sort of work up through this very classic hierarchy of needs that he came up with, Abraham Maslow. Okay, moving right along. Next is ritual. So the real question is that in order to, I believe, to ascend sort of to the levels that we're talking about, you really need a ritual. You really need routine. And the real question, I always say, is what makes you think you don't need it? All of us, speaking of pets, know that if you have a pet, or a child for that matter, that if you don't have a good set of routines, life is complete chaos. And so what makes you think that you don't need that for yourself? You do need it for yourself. And that's why every culture and tradition has instituted regular rituals and routines. There's really no difference between a ritual and a routine. If you're not religious, that doesn't mean, you can't have a ritual. It just means something, it just means a routine. So how do you make a good routine, or how do you make a routine better? Well, you incorporate a different state of consciousness. So that's prayer, meditation, yoga, imagery, breath, morning emphasis. All cultures have spoken about doing some either morning prayer or morning yoga or whatever the case may be. There should be some opportunity for growth and learning. And how do you make it better? You layer in more routines throughout the day. And I often sometimes get the question when I try to incorporate more and more routines into someone's schedule, is that you're trying to make me into a robot? Well, no, because once you can free up your mind, and it's not, and a lot of the sort of things that are just going to happen during the day, if you can make them routine, then that is going to free your mind up for what really matters. It reminds me of Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein used to wear the same, I believe it was like the same, I don't think he had like, all the same shirt or something like that. Because quite frankly, he didn't want his mind to be bogged down by having to choose the clothes that in the morning. He wanted to be immersed in what matters for him, which was, all the scientific thinking that he was up to. So by incorporating routines, it's not going to make you a mechanical being. It's going to be able to free you up, believe it or not, free up your mind to be able to think about other things that potentially are more important for you. All right, so moving right along, close this down. And I'm going to just check the time. I'm going to skip levels of awareness for now and go over to, maybe we'll come back to it at the end. Let's talk about environmental influences. So we start out, and it's very similar to what we were speaking about. We start at the lowest level, which is really a concern about air, food, and water. And in other lectures, other episodes we've spoken about, what is it about food? We spoke about that a little bit today. How about air? Is the air in our environment clean? What can we do to improve it? Can we get an air filter? Can we buy plants that have been known to clean the air? We did an episode on this. Same thing with water. How can we improve the water? Do we know the water quality? Can we improve it? Can we get a filter? Can we get a reverse osmosis? There's so many other ways of improving this. Then we deal with basic shelter. So once we have basic shelter, then we want to craft a home of health. And these are some of the basic elements of a home of health. Homes of health and homes of growth essentially are going to start from the bottom. Well, let's start from the top. They're going to have a sacred or recharge space. In other words, we should all endeavor, if we can, hopefully we have enough of a space. It could be just the corner of a room with a chair, but we should all have a place in our environment that is a place for us to be able to sit down or lie down, that is what that is there for. And some of the elements that can make this space have more impact by having environmental cues is there can be meaningful books or images in this area. There should be reasonable quiet. If you can't, then maybe headphones. Obviously, it should be comfortable. Maybe incorporating aromatherapy or some sort of aroma. You should be entering this little space, which again could just be a corner of your apartment as a routine. And then maybe there's music involved. But these are some of the elements of a sacred space, or just a recharge space. Saying sacred space makes it sound like kind of a new agey type of thing. But most cultures, people, let's say, who are doing a morning prayer would do the morning prayer in the same place every day. And as a result, that area would become sort of a sacred area for prayer. But all of us should think about these sort of basic elements of a healthy home. The next is your area of sleep conducive to sleep? That's called sleep hygiene. We did a whole talk on that. What are the lights like? Have we disengaged from technology an hour or two before we go to sleep? An eating area that facilitates communication. Do we have an area? We all know that developmentally speaking, children are much better off when they're sitting with their families and they're talking to their families over food. This is when the family relaxes. Or the community relaxes because you need to have relaxation to be able to digest. It is a place of communion, of connection, and this all occurs around the idea of eating. And I think a lot of people, a lot of discussion is leaving out the communication aspect of eating and just focusing on the nutrition. But in order to have a healthy home, an optimized home, a home where you again are ascending this sort of imaginary level of hierarchy to a refined space, you need to have an eating area or enforce an area where there's no tech engagement and there is communication and a review of the day or whatever the case may be around the table. And then, of course, ongoing removal of things without value should always be an assessment of around the apartment or house. Is this contributing to increasing the value of the house? Not financially speaking, of course, talking more about value in terms of life value. After you've created the home of health, imaginarily speaking, and you've done that, then usually the next step is to work on your contact with nature. And I always say feet on the ground, hands in the soil. Doesn't mean, getting feet on the ground, connecting to the earth is an incredibly important thing for everyone. If you live by a beach, you're very, very lucky and you can dig your feet into the sand and really feel connected. And I always say hands in the soil because by engaging with the soil, you improve your microbiome. You are engaged microbiologically speaking with the world around you. That could be petting a dog or working with plants, but these sorts of things actually improve your health when you're doing that. And then then after you have this contact with nature, usually the next thing is concern with the local community and what you can do to improve the local community. And then, of course, above that would be concern for the greater world. Many people have made the observation that people who are who jump right into concern for the greater world without sort of taking care of what's happening at home, they're maybe going in the wrong direction. Nonetheless, that's something else. All right, so let's go to movement and mechanics, and we'll call it an evening. Now, starting with the lowest level, and that is mobility, which I've spelled wrong here. And what I mean by that is obviously just the ability to move around, which, thinking about rights and privileges, again, can be taken away from you. So mobility is an incredible privilege. The ability to walk and move around is a remarkable, miraculous privilege that if once you realize how much of a privilege it is, then you would want to expand energy to be able to enhance and protect that mobility. And that's what these levels go ascending up this hierarchy of movement mechanics is all about. So first we start with mobility, the privilege, incredible privilege of mobility. Then we move to functional strength having the ability to do and to lift and to achieve all the functional things about living, shopping, cleaning, etc. Next, we move to flexibility. And once you get to flexibility, you have increased functional abilities as well, and you're able to be a little bit more than just functionally strong, and you have some flexibility to be a little bit better than just functional strength. The next is goal-directed movement, and this is when I should actually almost call it instead of a goal, which is sort of a fixed endpoint. It's really like an aim more than anything else. An aim is sort of a direction, or maybe just directed movement. I think I'll just call it directed movement. And what directed movement is an ongoing improvement in something requiring movement. This could be exercise, so increasing your strength. It can be dance, where you are trying to perfect some sort of movement. Of course, Tai Chi or Qigong, which is where you're essentially perfecting a certain kind of movement that's supposed to enhance your health. And these are ongoing things that require continual effort and continual improvement. So it's directed in a direction. I guess you could. It's in a direction to go. So you, as well as, of course, yoga is another one as well. As you do these, of course, you start to realize all the different levels of martial arts would be another one. You start to realize all the levels of subtlety and development that are required when it comes to movement. And of course, we all think about the Kung Fu master or the yoga guru or the Qigong master or the masterful dance instructor who, it just flows out of them so easily that they become, essentially like a master of it. But it's this ongoing continual improvement. After you start working on this, then the next level of this sort of movement mechanics is refinement of the mechanics, refinement of the body posture, of the movement, an increase in bodily awareness, which could involve, these classes that are continual practice, maybe body work, understanding the rejuvenation required after these exercises. All of these things are what the next step is. I spent some time when I lived in California studying something called the Alexander technique, which is a way of increasing bodily awareness through posture and movement. And all of these sort of movement and I guess all these things that are involved with movement have an incredible amount of depth to them and learning involved in them that many of us don't engage with. We go to the gym. The key with going to the gym is that it should be an ongoing amount of, you should be continually moving in a certain direction. It shouldn't be static. There should always be an additional goal or an additional direction that you should be going. As you finish one exercise, how are we going to mix it up? There's always this continual improvement when it comes to movement. The next is movement without thought. The master, and this is the analogy of a tightrope walker. A tightrope walker, when he gets on the tightrope, he's not thinking about what step to take. Because if he were to actually physically think about, okay, I'm going to take this step like this, he's going to fall right off. At some point in time, he becomes sort of like a master, and the thinking sort of moves down into his sort of breathing. His like rhythmic system is where he's in control, and he just becomes effortless, not thinking at all. And that's what happens with the master dancer, who it looks as though he just moves effortlessly and there's no thought involved. It's like the body becomes a vehicle for this movement, bypassing the brain. That's the next step. And then of course you become a master and then a teacher. And this is sort of the hierarchy of movement and mechanics. And so we tend to think of ourselves as starting out with understanding what our privileges are, and then realize the magnificent amount of unfoldment that can actually occur once we try to, whoops, sorry about that. So once we realize this, this privilege of mobility, it's amazing what we can then achieve by going through sort of and understanding this hierarchy. And same thing about looking at your environment. It can start out with just basic food, air, and water, to basic shelter, to creating a home of health, and then contact with nature. And then that can yield something incredibly great with then being engaged with the local community. And the same thing goes with your mental state as well as your nutrition. So that's what I wanted to discuss tonight, this idea that thankfully, almost everything that we discussed tonight, in some way, because of modern convenience and the blessings that we have in living in North America, we have a capability of being able to really achieve and to realize how lucky we are, and to reinforce those things so that we can really ascend this level regardless of our background, regardless of, generally speaking, our socioeconomic status. And we all have the capability of, as I always say, becoming our own authority by understanding these things and progressing one by one through these different hierarchies. So thank you everyone for your attention tonight. I did something of next week. Actually, we'll be talking about stress and the brain. And then the week after that, we'll be talking about how various types of relaxation affect the body. And that one should be a very interesting one, because we often focus on the body, and rightfully so, but actually there are some very, we spoke about one of them tonight, which was breathing. Just being able to slow your breathing down to a certain frequency can induce incredible bodily relaxation and rejuvenation. That's one example, but we'll talk about others as well, and that'll be in 2 weeks. So I wish everyone a great night, and since we're at the new year, I wish everyone a happy and healthy new year, and I look forward to continuing this every Wednesday night, and my best wishes for a happy and healthy new year for everyone. Have a great night. Bye-bye.